Mansa.
Hello and welcome to the Mansa Initiative. The Mansa Initiative is an independent think tank in Sri Lanka which provides a platform for critical analysis, intellectual dialogue, and policy advocacy on economic, political, and social issues. We are pleased to present you another episode of this interview series under the theme Rising China. Through this interview series, Mansa brings about the views of intellectuals and experts on various dimensions of the miraculous development experience of China by drawing parallels for Sri Lanka. This interview is with Dr. Shuwen, lecturer in international economics, Chongqing Jiaotong University, China, to talk about inbound and outbound foreign investment of China. Dr. Shuwen has obtained her PhD degree from the University of Colombo. Here is Dr. Sirimala Beratna, professor in economics from the University of Colombo, to conduct the interview with her.
Thank you, Dr. Shuwen joining Mansa Initiative. Joining from China to talk about Rising China. And the topic that we are going to discuss today is inbound and outbound investment of China. Now, if you go back to 1979, we don't see any direct foreign investment arriving in China. But after that, in the 1980s, we see it is rising to 1 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion after that. And then during the last 10 years, every year we have seen over 100 billion foreign investment arriving in China. At the same time, something strange also happened. Rising outbound investment of China and flowing into other countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In fact, last year in 2020, China was the largest foreign investment supplier in the world to the rest of the world. Now, my first question is, Shuwen, how did this miracle happen?
Thank you, Professor Aberatna. Yes, yeah. First, I would like to say I would like to divide into two sections. First, about the inflow FDI, then about Chinese outflow FDI. So, towards the FDI inflow, that was there was a lot of background for the attractiveness of China. What happened is first, before 1978, open economy. China, in certain aspects, has well-developed infrastructure development, especially in, of course, urban area. And the other one is, the second one is China had maintained a sustainable policy to encourage the international investors without any hostile attitudes. And third is China had abundant raw materials. And the fourth one, which is very important, that was discipline the market, including specifically discipline the labor market. So it was not like quite a lot of countries in those days, even in South Asia or African countries, that was facing a lot of strikes. So in China was very peaceful and well disciplined. And the fifth one was the largest domestic market. So what happened is when the investment first came, the most of the cases was focused on export processing and re-export to where it was from. But as the middle class was growing in China, so these investors also start to invest in Chinese market its own, so became very attractive for those investors. And of course, China also selected certain investment specifically that was promoting the employment and but less service-related investment at the beginning. However, at a later stage, perhaps past 10, 15 years ago, China started gradually focus on the investment, foreign investment from the low, in terms of services. And then from the other side, how this ODI outflow investment happened. That was, in fact, because the trade surplus has continuously maintained between China and the rest of the global market. So there was a substantial, very high foreign exchange reserve. And after this, they had a lot of economic crisis. For example, in 1997, in Asia, and then specifically 2008, this economic crisis, the global recession. So China realized should less depend on international trade in contributing Chinese growth. So let's develop the Western market. Therefore, China tried to diversify its global market. And the investment, second one, investment focused on different areas. For example, in certain countries, developing countries, it focused on trade and transportation related infrastructure development, what has experienced in Pakistan and a lot of other Bangladesh, other South Asian countries, excluding India and a lot of countries in ASEAN countries and Africa. So, so this one tried to create the trade access for raw material that needed for Chinese own industrial development. And it also create export access for Chinese goods for the growing middle class in these countries. And the third one is to seek for international brand and technology recognition. What happens is that China is through joint venture and merge and acquisition with the companies from industrialized economies. So they can expand their global market. But from the other side, Chinese consumers are also very much aware of the brand recognition. So those brands also been heavily promoted by Chinese company because they bought it. So they also expanded their own Chinese market. And then the fourth one is with those investments, they upgrade the technology ladder to increase the Chinese own per capita productivity. And then so therefore China could shift its labor intensive investment to shift it and then change to capital and technology intensive industries. And the last one, which is the Belt Road Initiative, and its related policy and institutes, for example, the establishment of Asia Infrastructure Development. So this try to help the young Chinese outflow investment to have a kind of soft landing develop in foreign countries. In fact, you know that China, it is rather new in terms of ODI, but it grows rather intensively with these kind of factors. Thank you. That's my answer.
Thank you, Shuwen. Thank you, Shuwen, for the very comprehensive, detailed explanation about why China was attractive to foreign investment as a recipient country and how China grew as a supplier of foreign investment to other countries, other regions, Africa, Asia, and Latin America also. Thank you, Shuwen. Your explanation Before I move on to the next question, your explanation was quite impressive on a couple of things. And one thing, because one of our purposes in this discussion is to draw parallels for the country like Sri Lanka. Of course, Sri Lanka is not a strange country for you. You have lived here for so many years. And so that you mentioned that one of the attractive factors for foreign investment was the large domestic market in China.
Yes.
So I don't think that this is now, some of the countries are small countries like Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Very small, 21, 22 million people compared to 1.3 or 4 billion people in China, very small. So that we don't have a hope about attracting FDI, or what is your view about that?
What I believe is really Sri Lanka has a very attractive position to attract investment. What happens is that, well, first of all, China sees China is a strategic location, which we all we all have heard, and we also think. I mean, personally, I believe that is the point. What happens in the case of, for example, India, well, China with India, both are trade partner, the major trade partner of each other, but the investment is really, really low. So I have, as my study was focused on Chinese investment in South Asian countries. So the major investment, the biggest investment from China went to Pakistan, but only the second one went to India, and there was even a big gap. So what happens that investors from China very hesitate to go to India to invest. It is because political and then policy unfriendly, that's not very it's not friendly. So what happens that Sri Lanka has a very good position because it has it's part of SAC country and economic collaboration. And China do have extensive economic cooperation with each other, but only for so far it is only through trade, but not investment. And
Right.
a lot of investors, so Sri Lanka could take this opportunity with its both collaboration with China and with the region, its role, so that can bring certain advantage. And of course, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Shuwen. And yeah, Sri Lanka is strategically positioned in the Indian Ocean so that it has a potential to attract a lot of foreign investment, but not for the domestic market purpose, but serving the regional market and probably global market. So although
Yes.
in the same case applies to smaller countries like Dubai and Singapore.
Singapore, yes.
Singapore, yes. And last year, I remember over 90 billion, even in the midst of COVID pandemic issue, $90 billion came to Singapore also. So the smallness doesn't matter as long as they have a big market. Thank you. And also,
Yes.
China's another point that you mentioned is that China has a global market, which was attractive to foreign investors. So I think you don't have to answer that question. That also tells us that Sri Lanka should also have a global market to attract investors.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So then I'm going to move on to our next question. And in fact, we know that China has a miraculous growth over the last 20 years or so. Obviously, the policy reforms started in the late 1970s and accelerated in the 1980s, so that 1990s onwards, growth picked up, investment picked up, and over 100 billion investment every year came. So how this foreign investment, what was the role played by foreign investment in this miraculous Chinese economic growth and exports?
Yes. Yeah, from this point that FDI inflow played a really very significant role on Chinese growth, which specifically helped China to increase its employment rate and absorb the rural labor coming to the industrial sector. And in addition, what happened is that China keen on sort of utilize this investment to improve its technology know-how, management know-how, and build up their skilled labor, this big source. So therefore, so this international market and created and leads to this economic trickle down. A lot of companies, they were working for those investors, and later they withdraw from it, and then they emerged as their own local export firm to engage in those industrial activities that created, built up the industrial chain within China and the production networks. So that extensively reduced the labor, the production cost and the transaction cost within China. So what happens that despite that Chinese labor cost is keeping increasing, but China, most of the Chinese companies, when they move out from China, they are still not keen on to look for cheap labors, because even in this Chinese domestic market, they could make everything together, the transaction cost, the whole production cost less. So that made a big change for Chinese economic growth. And this also paved the way for China to upgrade its technology in further phase of development.
Thank you, Shuwen. And you mentioned that these attractive points have enabled the Chinese economy to grow fast, because those investors, they find Chinese market is cost effective, and they have a bigger market to serve, to export their product, and also integrated with the global production network. By the way, I must say that Sri Lanka has a very weak integration with the global production networks, according to data. Now, I have a critical question to ask you, Shuwen, which is,
yes,
now many people argue that most of these Chinese investment coming to other countries are state-owned enterprises, not private investment. And some people also in Sri Lanka say that most of the Chinese companies, they are working here, they are in the construction industry, they are doing business here, and many of them are government-owned enterprises and not the private enterprises. Do you agree with that, or has it changed, or what is the outlook now? Why Chinese private investors are still reluctant to come to Sri Lanka? A lot of questions I have.
yes, yeah, that's very interesting question. And I would like to, from broader view, I would like to say it's yes and no. So there's a part of history from that. For example, before 2000, China was absolutely very closed in terms of its outflow investment. But in 2000, so this, which we call the go out policy, started. And so it was promoting Chinese firm to invest abroad. But that was also started with state-owned companies. And but a few years later, in 2003, so they have specifically said allow private firms to invest abroad. So that therefore, only after 2003, private firms start to emerge in global market. And what happened is that when China goes out for the investment, it is started from transportation-related infrastructure that connect with trade trade activities, and which also is so what Chinese need to help is to depends on the what I like to say is that it depends on the location of FDI. For example, in industrialized economies, you don't really have a lot of investment from state-owned enterprises. Normally, they go there for merge and acquisition and look for technology international market. So most of private firms has become very visible. In fact, I think now more than 60% of total outbound investment was from private firms. But what happens that in the case of Sri Lanka and many other developing countries?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
An important,
Yes.
very important question. I wanted to ask that, and we are yet to receive that private investment to Sri Lanka. And what do you want to? I want to ask you. Probably that may be our last question to answer.
Yes.
Why private Chinese investments are reluctant to come to Sri Lanka, or they are still wait and see? Oh, what do you think that we have to make any changes here at home in Sri Lanka to attract private Chinese investment? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, when I was doing the research, I found a few private Chinese enterprises in Sri Lanka, and actually they were doing quite well. But because of the prominence of Chinese investment engaged in infrastructure so large and prominent, so they are really less visible. I would take one example. There is a Chinese bicycle manufacturing investor. So he he came to Sri Lanka in 2004, and within several years, it became the largest bicycle export of Sri Lanka, bigger than DSI, and I think there was one large bicycle company export. So it was the biggest. So which was so what? But when I asked this person, he said he didn't. He came here. It is for which is called the GPS Plus advantage, because there is a restriction from EU market on Chinese export goods. So coming to Sri Lanka and provide additional services, assemble these activities. So does promote these exports. So it also attracts him company to come to Sri Lanka. So this indicates that Sri Lanka should hold its advantage that connected with the global market and China. So China could utilize this access for manufacturing, industrialized sector coming to Sri Lanka. And what I know, even, for example, there was some kind of Chinese investment, which was a pure, I believe it is a pure Chinese investment, like this port city. It is not from the loan, but investment. So they are the one try to attract global developers and to build up the buildings. Of course, with Chinese own advantage, they mainly attract more Chinese investors coming to Sri Lanka. And another one, it is, but it takes a substantial time. That's what I would understand. But in another case, that is this Chinese investment zone during the pandemic last year. So this Chinese major developer involved in this investment zone, they have signed a big agreement for tire factory that worth 300 million US dollars. So, so it is China is trying to utilize the access of Sri Lanka, and I think, of course, for its in this case is material, raw material such as rubber, to get its access for natural resources. So what I feel is that Sri Lanka able to attract a lot of investment, not from China, and then it needs a kind of strategy to utilize, in a sense, its access towards the global market, to make a connection, which it is well connected with this global value chain. So that will attract a lot of investment. It's not just from China.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned a very important point, very important critical point, and I want to connect that. You also mentioned that the bicycle manufacturer from China came because of the GSP plus concession that we have, that we enjoyed, Sri Lanka enjoyed from the EU market. And so along those lines, I want to ask, just take a very short answer from you, about 1 or 2 minutes answer. Now, we also have a FTA with India, and
Yes.
GSP plus with European Union. At the moment, it is on hold, but if we can also have a free trade agreement with European Union, UK, and many other countries in the region, including India, the one that we already have. And are they helpful for Chinese private investment to take place here in Sri Lanka? Because then the Chinese investors can look for all these markets, global markets that are connected to Sri Lanka. What is your view about FTAs?
I must say it is really very much. Why it's like that? Again, I take this bicycle company because it has a really well studied. What happened is that first they aim for EU countries with this GPS plus that Sri Lanka has a hold, but later they still was due to their prominence of export, so they had a certain restriction from exporting to EU. Then they shifted to Indian market. What happens that between India and China, actually they have a complementary competitiveness with each other. So Indian company now, this Chinese company is collaborating with one largest Indian firm from Tamil region, and then this Chinese bicycle company is providing the material parts to in Sri Lanka, and the Indian company is assemble those bicycles in Sri Lanka and export to Indian market. So there is a great potential for that, but how the awareness of Chinese company and the Indian company can work together in Sri Lanka, that need to be something to think about, how to create this opportunity.
Thank you, Shu.
Yes.
It's very critical point that you mentioned, that even these geopolitical tensions and political differences across the nations, even those things can be overcome with our better economic relation. That's the final message that you gave to us. And also, we have a lot of things to learn from China. Have a global market and expand your market, domestic market, to conquer the global market, which will attract foreign investment, private investment, not only from China, even from other countries. Shuwen,
Yes.
so much for joining us from China and then giving us all these details from your home and enlightening us and contributing to our knowledge, as well as I hope that those information will be important for policy making as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, hope to see you again.
Indeed. I look forward to meeting you again in Sri Lanka and perhaps in China.